Welcome to our channel, Simply Wisdom. We will start with the story of Jacob. And our quote for Jacob's story is, "The greatest tragedy in life is not death, but a life without a purpose." Today we tell you the story of a man called Jacob. Once there was a farmer named Jacob. He worked hard every day, but he felt unfulfilled. One day, an old traveler visited and noticed Jacob's sadness. "Why do you look so lost?" the traveler asked. Jacob sighed. "I work, eat, and sleep, but I feel like I'm wasting my life." The traveler smiled and said, "The greatest tragedy in life is not death, but a life without a purpose." Inspired, Jacob started teaching young farmers what he knew. He found joy in helping others, realizing his true purpose wasn't just farming, but sharing wisdom. His life was never the same again. Hope you've learnt from Jacob. Please stay tuned for our next story about Leo. Our next story is about Leo. Our quote for Leo's story is, "The value of life is not in its duration, but in its donation." We tell you the story of a boy called Leo. There was once a little village where a young boy named Leo lived. Leo was kind-hearted, but always focused on getting more toys. One day, a wise old woman came to the village and noticed Leo constantly counting his toys. She asked, "Why do you keep counting them?" Leo replied, "Because the more toys I have, the better my life will be." The old woman smiled and said, "The value of life is not in its duration, but in its donation. It's not about how much you have, but how much you give." Confused, Leo thought about her words. Later, he decided to share his toys with other kids in the village. Seeing their happiness made Leo feel something new, joy from giving. From that day on, Leo no longer focused on collecting more. He discovered that sharing what he had brought far more happiness than counting toys ever did. Hope you've learnt from Leo. Please stay tuned for our next story about Sam. Our next story is about Sam, and our quote for Sam's story is, "Obsessed with time." We tell you the story of a boy called Sam. In a small town, there lived a boy named Sam who was obsessed with time. He had a clock collection and would spend hours making sure they were all in perfect sync. Sam believed the longer he lived, the better his life would be. He'd constantly say, "If I can just live a really long life, I'll be happy." One afternoon, a traveler passed through the town and stopped by Sam's house, noticing all the clocks. "Why are you so focused on time, young man?" the traveler asked. Sam proudly replied, "I want to live as long as possible. The more time I have, the better life will be." The traveler chuckled and said, "The value of life is not in its duration, but in its donation." Confused, Sam asked, "What does that mean?" The traveler explained, "It's not about how long you live, but about what you give to others during that time. A short life filled with kindness and helping others is worth more than a long life spent only thinking about yourself." Sam thought deeply. From that day on, instead of counting time, he spent it helping his neighbors, sharing his kindness and laughter. And soon, Sam felt happier than he ever had before. Hope you've learnt from Sam. Our next story is about Clara, and our quote for Clara's story is, "You are an original." We tell you the story of a girl called Clara. In the village of Oakwood, there was a girl named Clara who loved to dance. She dreamed of being the best dancer in the world, but she was afraid people would laugh at her. So, instead of dancing in public, she only practiced alone in her room, day after day, hoping one day she'd magically become great. One evening, her grandmother noticed her practicing and said, Why don't you show the world your gift, Clara? Clara sighed. I'm afraid of what people will think. What if they laugh at me? Her grandmother smiled kindly and said, We are all born originals, but most of us die as copies. Don't be afraid to show the world your true self. If you try to copy everyone else, you'll never find what makes you special. Clara thought about her grandmother's words. The next day, instead of hiding, she went to the village square and danced for everyone. At first, her heart raced, but as she danced, she felt free. To her surprise, people didn't laugh. They cheered. Clara realized that by embracing her originality, she could inspire others. From that day on, she danced openly, and her joy spread throughout the village. She had found the courage to live as her true self. Hope you've learned from Clara. Our next story is about Peter, and our quote for Peter's story is, You are an original. We tell you the story of a man called Peter. In the bustling city of Greendale, there lived a man named Peter who was obsessed with becoming rich. Every day, he'd chase after gold, jewels, and anything of value. He often said, If I can just fill my vault with treasures, I'll be the happiest man alive. One afternoon, Peter met an elderly man sitting by the park. The old man asked, Why do you look so tired, my boy? Peter replied, I'm chasing wealth. Once I'm rich enough, I'll be happy. The old man chuckled and pointed toward the nearby graveyard. You see that? The wealthiest place in the world isn't a bank or a treasure vault. It's the cemetery. Peter was puzzled. Why? The old man explained, In the cemetery lie people who died with untapped potential, unfulfilled dreams, and unused talents. They had ideas, visions, and gifts that could have changed the world, but they took them to their graves. Peter was stunned. He had never thought of it that way. The old man continued, True wealth isn't in gold. It's in discovering your purpose and sharing your gifts with the world before it's too late. From that day on, Peter stopped chasing treasure and started using his skills to help others, realizing that true wealth came from living with purpose, not money. Hope you've learned from Peter. Our next story is about Mia, and our quote for Mia's story is, Be authentic to self. We are all born originals, but most of us die as copies. We tell you the story of a girl called Mia. In the lively town of Maplewood, there was a young artist named Mia. Ever since she was a child, Mia loved to paint. But over time, she started comparing herself to others. Her paintings were unique, but they didn't look like the popular styles she saw in art galleries or on social media. Frustrated, Mia began doubting herself. I'll never be as good as the others, she sighed. Slowly, she stopped painting altogether. One day, Mia visited a local art fair, hoping to find inspiration. There, she met an older artist, Mrs. June, who was displaying her vibrant, one-of-a-kind pieces. Mia admired the artwork but asked, How do you stay so confident when your art looks so different from everyone else's? Mrs. June smiled warmly and said, When I was younger, I tried to copy what everyone else was doing. I wanted to fit in, but I realized something important. We are all born originals, but most of us die as copies. The world doesn't need more copies. It needs your unique voice, your original art. Mia thought about it and decided to embrace her own style again. She returned home, pulled out her brushes, and began painting from her heart, no longer worried about fitting in. Her work was bold, colorful, and uniquely her. Soon, Mia's art gained attention, not because it looked like everyone else's, but because it was truly one of a kind. She realized that the beauty of life is in being an original, not a copy. And from then on, she embraced her individuality with pride. Hope you've learned from Mia. Stay tuned for our next story. Our next story is about Thomas, and our quote for Thomas's story is, "Your past may have shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you." We tell you the story of a baker called Thomas. In the quaint village of Willowbrook, there lived a baker named Thomas. Thomas had a troubled past. As a young man, he had made many mistakes, poor choices that hurt his friends, family, and even his own business. Though years had passed, he couldn't shake the guilt. He believed he didn't deserve happiness or success. Every day, he'd wake up early, bake his bread and pastries, but his heart was heavy. He avoided socializing, always keeping to himself, believing people still judged him for his past. One morning, while delivering bread to the local inn, Thomas met an elderly traveler named Mr. Hargrove. The traveler had a warm smile and a friendly demeanor, and he quickly struck up a conversation with Thomas. Noticing Thomas's sadness, Mr. Hargrove asked, "Why do you seem so burdened, my friend?" Thomas sighed. "I've made too many mistakes in the past. I don't think I can ever escape them." The traveler smiled gently and said, "Don't let your past dictate who you are, but let it be part of who you will become. Your past may have shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you. You still have the power to decide what kind of person you'll be from now on." Thomas was taken aback by the wisdom of those words. He had been punishing himself for so long that he had forgotten he had the power to change. That night, Thomas reflected deeply. The next morning, he woke up with a new sense of purpose. He started greeting his customers with a smile, offering free bread to those in need, and connecting with his community. Slowly but surely, he built a new reputation, one of kindness and generosity. Thomas realized that his past didn't control his future. Instead, it became the foundation for the compassionate man he had grown into. Hope you've learned from Thomas. Stay tuned for our next story from Ella. Our next story is about Ella, and our quote for Ella's story is, "Your vision is not what you see, but what you see when you close your eyes." We tell you the story of a young woman named Ella. In the town of Lakeside, there was a young woman named Ella who dreamed of becoming a great architect. Ever since she was a child, she'd sketch buildings and dream of designing grand structures that touched the sky. But every time Ella tried to plan for her future, she became discouraged by the challenges ahead. She could only see the obstacles, the schooling, the competition, and her fear of failure. One evening, Ella's grandfather, a retired carpenter, found her sitting by the lake, staring at her notebook filled with unfinished sketches. He sat beside her and asked, "Why do you look so worried, Ella?" Ella sighed. "I want to be an architect, but the road is so hard. I don't know if I'll ever get there. I don't know what my future will look like." Her grandfather smiled and said, "Your vision is not what you see, but what you see when you close your eyes." Ella was puzzled. "What do you mean?" He continued, "The future you're imagining isn't about what's in front of you now. The challenges, the setbacks, the hard work. It's about the dream that lives in your heart. Close your eyes and see it. What do you see?" Ella closed her eyes and pictured herself standing in front of a building she had designed, her name engraved on the plaque. She saw families entering the building, children running through the halls, and people admiring her work. She smiled. "Now," her grandfather said, "hold on to that vision, and no matter what happens, Work toward it. Your vision will guide you through the tough times. Inspired, Ella returned to her sketches with renewed energy. She knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but her vision kept her moving forward, guiding her to build her future, one brick at a time. Hope you've learnt from Ella. Stay tuned as we learn from two brothers, Ethan and Jack. Our next story is about two brothers, Ethan and Jack, and our quote for their story is, "If we want things to change, we have to change ourselves first." We tell you the story of two brothers, Ethan and Jack. In the quiet town of Maple Grove, there lived two brothers, Ethan and Jack. Ethan was always looking for ways to improve things around him, while Jack was more laid back and content with how things were. They both inherited a small family farm from their parents, but the farm was struggling. The soil was dry, the crops weren't growing, and they barely made enough to get by. One day, as they stood in the barren field, Ethan said, "Jack, we need to make some changes, or we're going to lose everything." Jack shrugged. "The farm's always been this way. What can we do? We should just accept it." Ethan shook his head. "No, if we want things to change, we have to change ourselves first. We need to learn new farming techniques, improve the soil, and invest in better seeds." Jack frowned. "But that sounds hard. What if it doesn't work?" Ethan smiled. "If we want to change the world around us, we have to change ourselves first." Determined, Ethan began reading books, talking to other farmers, and learning everything he could about sustainable farming. Slowly, he started applying these new ideas. He planted cover crops to enrich the soil, built a water irrigation system, and introduced crop rotation to keep the land healthy. At first, Jack watched skeptically, but when the crops began to flourish, he couldn't deny the transformation. The dry, barren fields became lush and full of life. A year later, the farm was thriving, and they were producing more than ever. Jack finally admitted, "You were right, Ethan. We had to change to see the results." Ethan smiled and said, "If you want to change the world, change yourself first." From that moment on, they continued to grow, not just as farmers, but as individuals. Hope you've learnt from Ethan and Jack. Stay tuned for our next story about Lily. Our next story is about Lily, and our quote for Lily's story is, "Success isn't a destination, it's a journey." We tell you the story of Lily. In a bustling city, there lived a young woman named Lily who dreamed of becoming a famous chef. She spent her days working in a small cafe, preparing simple sandwiches and coffee. Every day, she would watch cooking shows, follow famous chefs on social media, and imagine herself running her own high-end restaurant. One day, after a long shift at the cafe, Lily sat with her best friend Sarah, feeling frustrated. "I want to be a famous chef, but nothing's happening. I'm stuck making the same boring meals every day," she complained. Sarah smiled knowingly and said, "Lily, success isn't a destination. It's a journey. It's not just about the end goal. It's about what you do every day to get there." Lily frowned. "But how do I even start? It feels like I'm so far away from where I want to be." Sarah pointed to the kitchen behind the cafe counter and said, "Why not start here? Every dish you make can be a step on your journey. You don't need a fancy restaurant to be great. You just need to make today's dish your best one." Inspired by Sarah's words, Lily returned to work the next day with a new attitude. Instead of rushing through her tasks, she began experimenting with new flavors and techniques, turning the simple cafe meals into something special. Soon, customers started noticing and complimenting her creativity. Word spread, and before long, local food critics came to the cafe to try Lily's dishes. Her reputation grew, and she was eventually offered the chance to run her own kitchen. Looking back, Lily realized that Sarah was right. Success wasn't a single moment or destination. It was the daily effort, the small improvements, and the love she put into each dish along the way. Hope you've learnt from Lily. Stay tuned for the next story about Tom. Our next story is about Tom, and our quote for Tom's story is, "The difference between who you are and who you want to be is what you do." Today, we tell you the story of a boy named Tom. In the village of Brightwood, there was a boy named Tom who always dreamed of being an adventurer. He admired the legendary explorer, Sir Edwin, who had traveled the world and returned with thrilling stories of treasures, mountains, and distant lands. Tom, however, was timid and unsure of himself. He spent his days imagining adventures, but never dared to set out on his own. One afternoon, as Tom sat by the town's riverbank, Sir Edwin himself passed by. Noticing Tom's glum expression, Sir Edwin asked, "Why do you look so troubled, young man?" Tom sighed. "I want to be an adventurer like you, but I'm just not brave or skilled enough. I could never do what you've done." Sir Edwin chuckled. "You know, Tom, when I was your age, I was just like you. I wasn't born an adventurer. I had to become one. The difference between who you are and who you want to be is what you do." Tom looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Sir Edwin smiled and said, "It's simple. If you want to be brave, take small steps toward bravery every day. If you want to be skilled, start practicing now, even if it's something small. Adventures don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with a single step." Inspired by Sir Edwin's words, Tom decided to start his own journey, no matter how small. The next day, he set out on a hike to the nearby hills, his first ever adventure. It wasn't far, but it was a start. Over time, his hikes grew longer, his confidence stronger, and before long, Tom became known as the village's newest adventurer. Tom realized that becoming the person he wanted to be didn't require a magical transformation. It simply required action, one step at a time. Hope you've learnt from Tom. Thanks for watching.